Welcome to Dark Water Rising. Let's start on page 92, chapter 12. Floating furniture thudded against the first floor ceiling right below me, and still the water rose. It sloshed around me while I sat in the dark hall, elbows propped on my knees, arms wrapped around my ears. I speculated, considering my position near the east bedrooms, what I would do if I heard that final great crack, that signal to all of us that the house was breaking apart. I'd likely be crushed under its weight, or maybe thrown right through the missing roof, immersed in muddy, pitch-black water, and tangled in debris to drown. There seemed to be no real hope for any of us. Like the cold, fear crawled along my skin and soaked right through to my bones. I shivered so hard my teeth rattled. Josiah moved closer, and I leaned into him, grateful to share his small portion of warmth. I think I might have dozed some then, but if so, it was a brief and fretful escape, with the wind howling and the house rocking so. Then voices, close voices, cut through my weariness and brought me to my feet. "It's coming from the west side," Mr. Mason said. Josiah and I hurried after him into the windy west bedroom, crawling through water and across an overturned bureau and spilled drawers. A light shone through a broken window, and I stared at the pale glow, unable to fathom its meaning at first. A full moon stared back at me, a lantern suspended in a black sky, and the sweet realization sunk in. Even though the wind still howled like wolves, its teeth, exposed by moonlight, didn't look quite as sharp as they had. Waves crashed against the wall and in through the second-story window, drenching us badly, but bringing the voices even closer. "How many?" I asked, blinking from the salt spray. Mr. Mason leaned across the sill. "4, I think." He stretched out his arm. "Here, quick, give me your hand," he shouted. He pulled Mr. and Mrs. Collum from an upturned roof and dragged them through the window. Then Mrs. Longino shoved her 6-week-old son into my arms, while she and her husband scrambled from their wind-tossed raft just in time. It scraped against the house and was swept away. "Was there anyone else?" Mr. Mason asked. Mr. Longino shook his head and pulled the back of his wife's skirt up over her bare shoulders. Wind and debris had shredded much of their clothing, and the poor woman shivered from the cold. Sobs poured from Mrs. Collum as she told us how their house had broken apart and their cherished pets had to be abandoned. "The parrots kept calling, 'Mama, Mama,' and we couldn't do a thing to save them." Mr. Mason tried to comfort her, but it was the baby that troubled me most. He was soaked through and lay limp in my arms. I wrapped his cold hands in mine, shook him a bit, and studied him in the pale moonlight. He didn't stir. Hugging him close, I led the way back down the hall to the bathroom. Mrs. Vedder must have recognized the voices, for she stood in the doorway waiting, faint candlelight sputtering behind her, arms held wide in welcome. Full of dread, I handed the baby back to his mother. She checked him tenderly, then hugged him close while tears rolled down her face. "Oh, Florence," she whispered to Mrs. Vedder, "he's gone." She slowly rocked back and forth. "My sweet little Tom is gone." Mrs. Vedder grabbed a shaving mirror and held it close to the baby's nose. We watched and waited. A tiny moist circle formed on the glass, and I heard Mrs. Longino suck in a surprised breath. Grateful tears flooded her cheeks. "He's going to be fine, darling, you'll see." Mrs. Vedder patted her shoulder. "We just need something warm to wrap him in." She squeezed past the crowd that had gathered around the door, dropped to her knees, and crawled into the battered west room. She returned shortly, her hair blown askew, and in her hand she gripped a cracked bottle of cordial. Under her arm she tucked a knitted woolen petticoat taken from the overturned bureau. She quickly stripped the baby of his wet clothing, wrapped him in the dry petticoat, and placed Catherine's purring kitten beside him for added warmth. Then she handed the baby back to Mrs. Longino and promptly poured the cordial into an empty shaving mug. "Strain it through your teeth in case there's any broken glass, and put it drop by drop into little Tom's mouth." Mrs. Longino nodded, and while she did as she was told, we waited. When I sat back down in the hall with the other men, I noticed that the water had receded. It was too dark to tell by how much, but the floor no longer sloshed beneath me. I rested my hand on Matt's baseball bulging in my pocket, and Josiah and I leaned against the soaked and crumbling plaster. My thoughts drifted from little Tom to 35th Street, from the faces of my family to Ella Rose, but they always ended up in the alley behind Butcher Miller's house, reaching for the woman and her child.